again, ChatGPT. I don't know if you remember, but I said I wanted to interview you for my podcast called Let's Think Digital. Are you still up for doing that?
Of course. I'd be happy to help with that interview. What would you like to cover?
Perfect. Well, you know what? We're going to start into it, and I'll ask you some questions as we go, if that's okay.
Sounds great. I'm ready when you are.
Data is the lifeblood of any organization, including government. And in today's digital age, there are very real questions about whether governments are capable of managing the enormous amount of data that is now collected. Every time you interact with a government service, tap on public transit, pass over a sensor on the road, or fill out a satisfaction survey, a data point is created. And there is high expectation that governments use these data points to make better decisions, that the data is managed responsibly, and that people in government have the ability to consume all of this data in an increasingly complex world. We're no longer in an era where data was created at a manageable rate with pen and paper on a government form. Instead, governments are increasingly being flooded with an avalanche of data from a huge number of sources, and they need to be ready for that flow of data, which is only going to get larger. This is especially true with the rapid evolution of artificial intelligence and the increasing incorporation of machine learning models, semantic analysis, and algorithmic decision-making applications into the processes of government. These are technologies being built on big data, and governments need to be prepared to leverage them in the public interest. So what should governments be doing? Well, this week, we're talking to a few people who are thinking deeply about the policy and capacity challenges that governments need to get ahead of when it comes to their data posture. First, we have Maddy Dwyer from the US-based Center for Democracy and Technology. She's done a lot of work on understanding the balance between leveraging data to improve the lives of citizens, including those from marginalized communities, but also the dangers if we don't do this responsibly. I spoke to her last November on site at the Forward 50 conference in Ottawa. And then we're talking to Anna Wong and Trevor Banks from the Government of Canada's Treasury Board Secretariat. Anna and Trevor have been working on efforts to support organizational change across the federal government to establish clear accountabilities and responsibilities for chief data officers and other senior digital and data leaders across the public service. I mentioned AI and how it's really driving home the need for governments to up their game when it comes to how it uses and manages data. Well, at the end of the episode, we're going to go straight to the source and have a little cameo from ChatGPT itself to hear what it thinks about all of this. I hope you enjoy our conversations. We're here on the conference floor at Forward 50 and really excited to be joined by Maddy Dwyer, who's joining us from Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And Maddy, you work for the Center for Democracy and Technology.
Correct.
Curious to hear a little bit about the work that you're doing and what your organization tackles in terms of their focus of their work.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, I work at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and we've been around for about 30 years now, so basically since the inception of the commercial internet. And we work on tech policy and specifically how, we can protect civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. Mm-hmm. And so that originally started out with, what does that look like on the internet and the commercialization of the internet. And now, obviously, over time, it's shifted into various different elements. So we have a team that works on national security issues. We have a team that does privacy and data of the private sector. So looking at social media companies and other platforms. And then our team is the Equity and Civic Technology Project. Yep. And so we focus on how government delivers public services in a responsible way that protects the civil rights of individuals.
So let's unpack that a little bit, in the work you're doing around equity and technology, right? Because I think people hear about this, certainly like ethical use of data and AI is big in the news these days. But I actually think sometimes it's tough to kind of like conceptualize what that means in practice. And I'm curious, in the research that you're doing, where are the areas that you're most concerned about today in terms of kind of having equity impacts or negative impacts on equity from technology and data?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give some table setting, our project specifically actually started out as the Student Privacy Project. Yep. So we were very focused on the impacts of data and technology use in the classroom on students. And a big project that we focused on, I think it started around 2019, 2020, so pre-me at CDT, was actually focused on the use of surveillance technology in schools, and how it was sort of going unnoticed by parents and students. It was just installed on laptops that were given to students, especially because of the pandemic.
And when we say surveillance technologies, just so people are clear on that, this is like tracking how kids are using their computers.
Correct.
Are we getting into like I know in some cases there's been with like taking tests online, there was like eye tracking or like facial tracking. Is it kind of all those types of technologies?
Yes. So that's a great question because surveillance can mean a lot of different things. And it sort of just depends on what we're talking about. So I think the thing that was coming to my mind was the use of student activity monitoring software, which is essentially software that's installed on a computer. There's really no indication that it's in use, that basically can track the activity of a student. So that means messages being sent, emails, pretty much anything that you're doing online. It's sort of noticing, what's the behavior that's going on, and it's intended to keep students safe. So, the purpose behind it is to, flag maybe an instance of someone's talking about self-harm. They can flag that, the school can handle it. But sometimes, there's unintended consequences of that. So we found through our quantitative research, actually, that, I think one thing that we saw a lot of is LGBTQ plus students were actually being outed by the software because some key terms such as, gay, lesbian, bisexual were being, flagged by the software, and the student would, inadvertently be outed that way because the teachers would find out that this had happened, and then just through conversation. So that's an alarming, I think, consequence. Another one that we've seen is student activity monitoring software actually disproportionately harming students of color. And we've seen that also with, tools like content filtering and blocking. So in the US, we have a law where schools need to have filters basically on all online content to filter out like things related to like nudity or porn. But sometimes there's more of an overbroad blocking of content. And so we've seen, alarming trends like that.
And so I'm curious about like in the US system, because obviously this can vary from country to country. Are these rules being set at the federal level, or is it at a state level, or is it individual school districts that are setting these types of rules?
Yeah, so it varies. So there's, federal laws such as FERPA, which is our federal privacy law for schools. We have COPPA, which is another federal law. And then states also have their own privacy laws. So it's really like a patchwork. I think for many years, I don't work on this personally, but CDT endorses a federal privacy law. We've been pushing for that for many, many years, and we're still pushing for it. That's sort of the landscape in the U.S.
And I'm curious too on these kind of school surveillance technologies. How does consent work on that? Like, are students just required because they're a student to have this? Do parents have to give consent? Can they choose to opt out of having surveillance technologies? Yeah,
so I think that's an ongoing conversation. So obviously, there's protections, like I said, in FERPA and COPPA. But right now, there's, with this software, there's not really a great consent mechanism. But I think our work at CDT is hopefully surfacing that these things are happening in schools. And, schools should involve parents in these conversations because it's critical that they, have a say, that students have a say. And so in a lot of our work, not even just in the education sector, we really focus on having robust community engagement of, bringing everyone who's affected by these technologies to the table, because everyone has their own perspectives of, how it impacts them. And, even though the tools are meant to keep students safe, and tools in general, like, when we're talking about general government service delivery, I would like to think that the intent behind it is good. And, and it's to improve the lives of individuals. And so,
But as you said, the unintended consequences of this can happen quickly. And it sounds like part of your work then is advocating for legislative changes to be able to accommodate, or address some of these concerns that are coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one lever. I think another lever that we focus on is also just changes within agencies, whether that's federal agencies, state agencies. In the U.S., we have, education is state and local. And so we focus on that as well.
So just sticking with education for a second,
Yep.
you know, we're talking about surveillance technologies.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the other big ones that people are talking about in the context of education these days is generative AI tools.
Absolutely.
Things like ChatGPT coming into the classroom. Can you tell me a little bit about how you've been approaching those issues and what some of the research you're doing is showing about how that's impacting the classroom?
Yes, definitely. It's been a very large part of the conversation these days. So actually, our team at CDT has been conducting quantitative research for about 4 years now. So
Okay.
we started in 2020 asking about things like just basic student privacy, what teachers, parents, and students are thinking about that. And since then has obviously expanded to include generative AI. So in November of 2022, we saw the release of ChatGPT, which sort of took the education world by storm.
Took the whole world by storm in many ways.
Not even
Yeah.
just education. But particularly, there was the whole concern about academic integrity. I think schools were rushing to just try and figure it out.
Yeah.
I mean, as everyone was. So we really saw a need in our quantitative research to actually poll parents, teachers, and students about their use of generative AI in the classroom. And so we really saw that obviously like students were using it.
Yep.
And so that's the first iteration of our polling in March of 2024. We saw that students were using it. There was really a disconnect between parents and what's going on in the classroom. So parents really weren't aware that their students were using it
Right.
for anything. I think another interesting finding that we saw was actually students were using it more for personal reasons rather than,
for
using it to
school.
cheat on schoolwork. I think
Yeah.
there was a mad dash to say, oh no, like everyone's going to be using this to cheat. But we actually saw that they were using it more for personal reasons, so which I think from our perspective is, was a bit concerning.
Yep.
Because we know of things like generative AI has hallucinations.
100%, yeah.
So if a kid is going to ChatGPT to ask about, a personal concern that they have and
Yep.
it's feeding inappropriate information.
Well, even the sense of like, I think a lot of people, I don't want this to sound ageist because it's not just young people in general. People are using these tools as kind of search engines sometimes when they're not meant to be search engines, right? And
Absolutely.
to your point about hallucinations, there are some like Perplexity and other tools that are coming up that are really designed to do that. But a lot of the kind of base generative AI tools, particularly in the early days, are not meant to be kind of general knowledge tools in that way.
Right. And I think it's sort of, setting the expectation. I
Yeah.
think that's what we talk a lot about, within the school setting and even within government, like just having training
Yes.
and education
That's
about.
and that's what I was going to ask because in the schools that you're seeing or that you're studying, are they actually getting training on the use of generative AI? Are students doing this kind of like on the side of their desk, kind of unauthorized?
Yeah.
Or are schools actually embracing this in some way?
Yeah. So I think there's been a shift since we started surveying.
Yep.
So we did a survey in March, and then we wanted to quickly follow up after that.
Yep.
And we did see that, yes, there's training going on, but it's not as robust as we would like there to be.
Yep.
So, I think when we first saw it, the levels of training were low.
Yep.
And the training that they would receive, doesn't include very important things of, how are we protecting students? What does responsible use actually look like in the classroom? And so teachers were saying, yeah, like we got training once and we signed a form about it, which when there's these unintended consequences that can have detrimental impacts on a
Yep.
student's educational experience, I think the training needs to be more robust. And I know that there's organizations, working on that kind of training, and people are talking about it. The conversations are happening. So we're heartened to see that.
Yeah, and obviously the space is moving so quickly and the technology quickly, even something from 6 months ago tends to be outdated and obsolete very quickly, right?
Absolutely.
In terms of what these tools can do. Just last question on this, or thought experiment on this. I think there's also been this debate around bringing AI into the classroom as to whether this is a good thing or not, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard the comparison before to using calculators for math. This was, I remember when I was a kid growing up, like this was sometimes controversial of like, should you have to learn how to do math by hand or can you use a calculator,
Yep.
right? And I think some folks have said, well, listen, if AI is going to be part of our society, maybe we kind of think about it as a calculator, but in this case more for like writing, where instead of saying, no, you can't use it, you've got to be able to like use it responsibly and teach them that.
Absolutely.
The other side of the argument is, well, does it diminish critical thinking skills if people don't have to do that? I'm curious if you personally have kind of thought on which side of the debate you might land on.
Yeah. It's so funny. We're actually over here the other day sitting with some folks at Forward 50 talking about this very question of like, I think in whatever sector you're talking about, education or not, it's sort of this question of, is AI good or bad? And I think our perspective is, maybe that's not the right question. Like, it sort of depends, like the lawyer answer. It depends on how you're using it.
It's a tool, right?
Yes, it's a tool. It depends on the use case. I think another thing that we focus on is like risk level of like, if you're using it for something lower risk, there's always a risk, I think, when you're talking about especially third-party generative AI tools of, data privacy concerns. But, writing an email versus using it to, predict what students are at risk of dropping out, like those are two very different use cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you're bringing up data privacy. This is, I know, part of your work as well. And I'm struck often in these conversations around kind of digital modernization and government. There's this tension between data sharing and data privacy. And you obviously can't, I think, build a modern digital government if you aren't able to share data effectively, particularly across levels of government. But then people are very worried about data privacy. We see data breaches all the time. And I think, my sense is government generally is held to a higher standard than the private sector, which means they're much more under the microscope. So I'm wondering, from the sense of the work that you do, where you find that balance on it, right? Like, how do we still take advantage of the benefits of new technology while not kind of falling into the trap of losing trust because we've got huge data privacy issues? I'm like, is this a tension, or can the two work in parallel together?
Yeah. So I think generally our work at CDT, says that I think privacy and innovation do not have to, become at opposites of each other, that we can have both. And so I think in the U.S. specifically, in the government, I think my boss, Elizabeth Laird, said in her presentation yesterday that, the U.S. usually, I think, is procuring services from third parties. So I think it really starts with the procurement process of, having those checks in place of, are you asking the right questions of vendors? Do they have the right security measures? And if they don't, like, maybe we shouldn't be procuring a service from them. So we have, I think, procurement, though, again, it's not like a sexy topic. It's extremely, extremely important in terms of, setting those ground rules of, making sure that the government's using a service that has those security measures in place.
I mean, procurement comes up on the podcast time and time again, because you're right, it's not a hugely sexy topic, but it is so critically important to enabling what we want to do in terms of moving government forward.
Absolutely.
I mean, how do you feel the U.S. is doing on that in procurement, and maybe like specifically within your domain about tailoring procurement to doing smart shopping when it comes to AI vendors or protecting data privacy? Because I think, it seems like different jurisdictions are moving at different speeds on this. Do you have a sense that policymakers in the U.S. have kind of grasped that this is a big issue to focus on?
Yes, I think that more and more within the last 2 or 3 years, like, we are seeing movement on this. Legislatively and just regulatory. So in the U.S., we had the Office of Management and Budget release their memo, which included, some requirements for agencies in their reporting requirements. And also procurement. So they had a separate procurement guidance that came out that sort of included, guidelines for things you should be looking for when you're procuring an AI service. And I think that those are outstanding, starting points for having this federal guidance for agencies, because, this is complicated stuff.
Absolutely.
And so when you have that guidance for agencies, it absolutely makes a difference.
Absolutely. And what do you think the governments really should be focusing on? I mean, if you kind of, we're thinking about the impact the internet and our kind of modern data enabled environment has, I mean, do you have kind of a short list of saying, here are the top 3 or 4 things that all governments should be really thinking about in this space? Yeah,
I think something that we are really thinking about now and we're putting out work on is thinking first about, when it comes to AI, like, is AI actually the best solution for the problem you're trying to solve?
Right.
So we've done a lot of analysis of, executive orders across states and then federal action. And we've really seen that, government, when they're using AI, they really want to use it for 4 things. One is improving customer service. The second is reducing fraud and waste. The third is reducing administrative burden. And then the fourth is improving government service delivery. And sometimes, when you want to achieve those goals, like AI may not be the best use case. And so we're actually putting out a report soon on, how agencies can actually, sort of weigh the options of like, do we really need an AI tool to solve this? What's really going on here? And so I think that we want to start there. Another thing that we are doing some work on is, before you can have AI, that you need to have a good data governance system in place. And I think sometimes, with the AI conversation, we want to chase the shiny object of, we need this. Oh, we're really behind. We need this product. It's going to, revolutionize everything. But I think right now we're encouraging, I think, agencies to really take a step back and say, do we have like the basic like data quality in place to have these complex AI systems?
Well, I mean, the reality is AI is only as good as the data you have to feed it to it, right? Yeah, and I hope that's kind of the silver lining of the AI revolution, is that it's actually forcing government agencies to think about their data quality in a way that they sometimes don't.
Yes, absolutely. I would totally agree with that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Great to have you. Great to meet you.
You as well. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and we'll be sure to share some of your work in those reports in our notes for today's show so people can learn about what the good work that you're doing down there. So thanks again, Maddy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Anna and Trevor, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you with us.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Ryan.
So just to start off with, both of you are joining us from the Office of the Chief Information Officer at Treasury Board Secretariat. I'm hoping both of you could kind of share with us a little bit about the work that you do and the types of issues that your team is tackling. So Anna, Trevor, if you want to give us a kind of a quick introduction and let us know a little bit about your work.
Yeah, awesome. So it's pretty amazing. We have an awesome job and opportunity. We here help the GCCIO in terms of the development of digital talent. So digital being all the things, right? Like all the components, like data, like cyber, like technology that you need in order to have good, efficient, modern services. And so specifically on our team, we have the mandate to help find the skills that we need for today and the actual interventions that kind of help us get there, as well as provide guidance to organizations in how to structure their people, the types of leaderships that we need for today. So it's a pretty fun gig. And Trevor can tell you a bit more specifically about what he's up to and the focus of today's show.
Yeah, and Trevor, I was going to say, my understanding is you're working on this thing called digital organizational design, which might be kind of a term that isn't familiar for a lot of people, and would love to hear more about that.
It's a bit of a branding exercise because really what it is, it's about organizational shift. It's as much about organizational shift as it is about organizational design. So we've given this label to create curiosity around it. Like ask questions about it, because what is this thing? It's not the same old, same old. So really it's the old organizational readiness office that used to exist, but that created the generic work descriptions. But it's more than that now. So we're part of a new narrative that's emerging the story from IMIT to digital community. So we're creating a new foundational piece that goes with it. Really what that means is new accountabilities, new job descriptions, new places so we can actually bring people into the positions. So it's defining positions both for the C-suite and for the staff that's enable and make a digital community.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Actually, for me, this feels actually very full circle, and the two of you may not know this, but when I first joined government in 2010, 15 years ago now, which is hard to believe, and I joined what was the CIO branch.
That's right.
The team I was in was part of the old organizational readiness group. So they were kind of colleagues down the hall from me. So very interesting 15 years later to kind of see one of this role is still needed, but that it's evolved in a bunch of different ways.
I never told you this, but I joined government around that time, and I interviewed, not with you, but with your director at the time for an assignment. And I remembered you were doing the renewal for web and those guidelines and social media use. It was like the first one. And I just it was like starstruck. I was like, oh my gosh, he has such a great job. It's so cool. Never told you this, but anyways, I've seen and kind of watched you for quite a long time.
And I'll let you know the bags, Ryan, and I'll say I am now the new Ryan. So
Hey, that's great. I think the bar can only get raised, so that's great, Trevor. No, it was fascinating. I mean, I think the early policy work I did when I joined what was CIOB at the time was around exactly as you said, kind of those first social media guidelines of policy. And for a policy issue, thinking about how policy and new technology intersect with each other, it's a really fascinating space to be in. And I think that kind of links a little bit to what we're talking about on today's episode, because today's episode of the podcast, we're really diving into a couple of different aspects of data. And I think these days in 2025, when you talk about data, you have to talk about AI in the same breath. And a lot of organizations are, trying to think about how they deal with data. I mean, I think a common piece of feedback that we hear is government organizations saying they just have so much data that they can't handle it. But then on the other side, it's they can't find the information that they need or the insights that they need. It's like the person being shipwrecked in the ocean, surrounded by water, but have nothing that they can actually drink. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, because part of the work you're doing on organizational design is how to make government organizations better able to function in a data world. How would you describe the data landscape right now in government, and what's been changing in the last few years around this?
I think that's a really good question. And I would just step it back for a sec because it really kind of gets to the heart of the issue. I think one of the biggest reasons why there is so much kind of anxiety about data is because the accountabilities aren't clear, right? Traditionally, if you look at the Westminster system, so here and elsewhere, the notion of like the data bit kind of like resolved mostly in strategic policy shops, right? Because there was always a research function, a research arm, and maybe you had like a data warehouse where your program data was stored. This was certainly the case when I started my career and I was in immigration, and there was a warehouse, right? And kept all the stuff. We pulled up Cognos, and you're going to find out how many permanent residents do we have, and so and such. And that was sort of like a landscape for quite some time. But now, with the explosion of where we are in terms of technology and the ready tools that people have at their fingertips, right? You don't need to code anymore. I mean, you still do, but it's like the citizen development, like it is real, like it's here, it's a few prompts away. And we have to catch up with that in terms of our own organization and approach in the federal government, just like many jurisdictions here in Canada and internationally have already done. And so we, part of our work is kind of like peeling it back. So looking at, okay, where should data go? Like where should be the point of contact, right? Like in an organization. But as we kind of do that, we had to kind of relook, but what about everyone else? Right? Mm-hmm. Traditionally, departments have a chief information officer. We've had that for decades. It's well known, right? The career paths like this and that. But now we have a data function and we have chief data officers. We have chief transformation, innovation, whatever you call it, officers. We have that rise in the understanding of cybersecurity, right? And the integral role that plays. And we still have that very important technology function. But that's not a CIO. Right. And so as we've been looking at like where should data go, we kind of had to really unpack that in context to the rest of these, I'm going to call it the C digital suite. Right. Mm-hmm. And then that's sort of like where we're landing, where we're looking at these 4 different domains. So who is accountable for data, for technology, for cybersecurity, for transformation. Right? That idea of taking whatever business processes, depending on, where you are, and not modernizing, right? Because modernizing is like you can just do a thing, replace it with something digital, like digitization, but the transformation of that kind of end to end. And that's really where we have to, from my perspective, like look at that landscape. And when we look at that landscape, we see that these functions go really well together. Right? In an organization, if you have somebody at that sort of like VP level that gets it, that oversees all of those together, mm-hmm. that is one of the most powerful ways you can drive that digital transformation in your organization. So I just wanted to kind of bring it back a little bit to that before kind of diving into.
No, it's helpful, Anna, because I think, that governance piece can sometimes, not be really sexy for folks, but I think it's actually quite important, particularly in large, hierarchical, complicated organizations like government departments tend to be. And this evolution from the CIO having been kind of the catch-all for anything related to digital and data to now, I think, recognizing that it's such a big part of all the work the government does. You actually need some specialized leadership at that executive management table around these different pieces. I mean, I'd love to discuss all of this, but I think particularly zeroing in on the chief data officer piece, what's interesting, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think, really in earnest, this started in 2019 when the first GC data strategy came out, which was, I think, Treasury Board, PCO, and StatsCan came together with this data strategy. And it was actually interesting, 2 or 3 years ago now, I think it was in 2022, with the work I do with the Institute on Governance, we actually did a study with a handful of departments looking at that role of the chief data officer. Because what was interesting was in 2019, essentially part of that strategy was saying every department should have a chief data officer. But the path the different departments took in terms of where that position is located or what kinds of responsibilities they have was very different from department to department, as we saw. And I'm curious if both of you can maybe kind of comment on that evolutionary journey, for the last 5 or 6 years as this role of a chief data officer has kind of been evolving somewhat organically. And if I understand right now, you're trying to essentially kind of bring a little bit more standardization to what that role looks like across the GC.
Yeah, to reverse it, and we have now brought standardization to it. But to go back to the beginning of your story, it has been fascinating to see the organic growth of this idea and how it's emerged to different departments, because it's landed solidly, it's so massively that suddenly one department has an ADM called this, and it's completely side of the desk at others. And it's gone from just 2 years ago when we traced it to about 26 so-called self-proclaimed CDOs to now 44. So what we're really doing in that sense, though, is kind of bringing the consistency so that we know how to land it in the context Anna just described. Because again, the validity of this position is the spotlight that it brings on content. This is one of the major changes happening to really the idea that Anna described. We're going from that CIO IMIT construct, where digital is tech, to actually content, container, and design. Those are the foundational pieces we're really designing. And in our system, it goes back to accountabilities. And you're right, it's not sexy. It's the plumbing, like you've talked about. And that's a real key idea that you're like, oh, well, that's not the shiny object. I don't want to talk about that. But that's the job. That's who and how we make this system united, and and it's the starting point. That's really our main aim in having these accountabilities land. It becomes the systematic starting point. So the government of Canada, not randomly chosen departments who sort of fall into this, actually have a way of going forward.
Right.
And I would just maybe add,
please.
like Ryan, so great reference, right? Like, absolutely. This kind of all started like with the call to action in the 2018 first GC digital data strategy. That was like 3 years. One of the first missions was that everyone had to appoint effectively like a chief data officer and come up with the first, departmental data plan that would align with the GC-wide one. And it's interesting because if you look at the update, the current strategy, which is 2023 to 2026, again, one of the first action items now is not to create the position, create a plan, because now we're there, but is to better define that data leadership. Because since that's happened, we have seen such different approaches, which is great. In many ways, right? You learn from that, kind of a bit of a laboratory, if you will. But to a point where now, okay, we do need some consistency, and we need to understand, like, who do I call, right? If something happens, for example, there's an incident for cybersecurity, like, you probably know who to call. Like, there's a designated official for that, right? So what about for something related to data? Like, who makes that call, right? And so it's kind of great to see, like, even in the strategies, you can see that maturity happening. And now it's not yet public, so I can't share it at this moment. But internally, we have to work through with our chief data officer council a set of interim guidance. And so that provides that consistency. We have defined and worked really hard to have a set of 8 different accountabilities for chief data officers. In the ideal world, right? Understanding everybody has a particular context that they're working with, as well as the guidance on how do you actually apply that and how do you work vis-a-vis your other colleagues, right? For example, who are responsible for cyber or for transformation or for that traditional sort of CIO or what we now consider like a chief technology officer function.
Right. And is the guidance around these chief data officer positions as they become more standardized, is it getting into the level of saying, they should be an ADM level or DG level position, who they report to? Because that was one of the things we saw too, when we had done that 2022 study, is the chief data officers across the government of Canada, I think, Trevor, as you were saying, range from ADM level positions where they have, tens of millions of dollars in budget and a big team to, director or DG level where it was simply on the side of the desk and they were trying to do that along with 10 other things. How specific is this kind of formalization being?
Sure. It's a functional specificity. And this is the danger between really putting the cart before the horse and talking classification. Like everyone talks classification because they want the levels, the status, and we get why. But ultimately, we're defining the accountabilities within a functional context because at the end of the day, it's a scalability issue. Mm-hmm. If you're a small department, is that D&D? Not necessarily. So in this case, we are coming out with them contextualized as functions within a functional idea. The big change, to Anna's point about the Chief Digital Service Officer, is to express it as a new construct, dare I say equivalent to the old CFO 2001 construct. If the issue is that important, and it is, then we need the spotlight. And so our model has it right now, working off of a deputy head, the CDSO, the Chief Digital Service Officer. Now, in that context, therefore, the CDO ranks underneath. Right. Yes. So I'm not going to apply directly what does that mean from a leveling perspective, but from a functional reporting relationship, that's our model.
And just for clarity for those who are listening, so the Chief Service and Data Officer, Chief Service and Digital Officer, I should say.
Well, actually, Ryan, we're going to play some acronym bingo right now. So
please, let's do it.
Out. So, in fact, we went to copyright the Chief Service and Digital Officer acronym.
Yeah, we did.
Policy is sort of phrased that way, isn't it? It rolls off your tongue that way. Turns out the CSDO, Chief Science Data Officer. Like, oh, that's a thing. Okay, all right. Or Chief Service Delivery Officer. Oh, it's already spoken for. So our socialization aspect here is to go, get ready for it, write this down. Chief Digital Service Officer, CDSO. So
CDSO.
Acronym bingo. You're welcome.
A favorite pastime of all public servants, playing acronym bingo, so they can add CDSO to their bingo sheet.
In both official languages, of course.
In both official languages, yes. So Chief Digital and Service Officer. So this is, in a sense, and this will be a little bit kind of colloquialism, but it's kind of replacing the old CIO or Chief Digital Officer position, right? The idea is the CDSO would be kind of the senior most digital and data person within the organization, reporting directly to the deputy head of the organization, to the deputy minister.
And I think that's the key, right? Because before, and still now today, the traditional, I'm going to call the Chief Information Officer, reported to a corporate ADM.
Yes.
More times than not, right? And so they didn't have a seat at the executive committee, right? To provide that direct advice to the deputy head on whatever matters to the day. It was filtered through usually a CFO. Right. And so we are trying to elevate where appropriate, right? Like as Trevor is saying, the complexity. I mean, if you're like a tiny department and you have like two ADMs, that's probably not going to work out. You need a seat at the table. Like this is so important that you have to have that direct line.
Yeah, I mean, when I first joined government, in 2010, in most cases, exactly your point, Anna, the CIO, which is what we normally called them back then, they were normally reporting to an ADM of corporate services. And then, anything in the digital and data realm was one item amongst many, including, financial and corporate services and other issues. And listen, I will just say from my perspective, having been both inside the system and now working on this from outside, I'm really happy to see this because I think, digital and data and service is so core to what government does, ensuring that there is somebody at the senior management table who this is their full focus, I hope is actually going to be able to produce better governance, but really kind of drive the awareness of these issues at that senior management.
And that's why the definition of the accountabilities isn't a bureaucratic paper exercise. It really starts to define the aspects that we're going to be asking of the subsequent changes to the policy. It's going to be asking what we're looking for when we go recruiting for talent. It's going to be looking for the messaging and the style of leadership. And that's why I bring it back previously to the construct. The acronym bingo game we just played, or the things we're so used to. So IMIT, we know what that is. CIO, walk in the room, say what that is. I know what that is. We're going to be socializing the idea that the literal change is from the acronym IMIT to digital community. It's from CIO to CDSO. Does that mean a one-for-one change? And we're quite adamant on this one. No, it does not. It is not a CIO. As Anna said earlier, the CIO aspects split. Some of them go to the CDSO, the rest go to the CTO, and we define new elements because it is a different change in a way of landing how important this business model is.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and I think makes a lot of sense. So let me ask you, what does success look like to you? You know, if we were to have you back on the podcast 5 years from now in 2030, let's assume we're still going then. You know, what would be kind of for you the big indicators of success of this new governance model for data and digital in the government of Canada?
Okay, so my answer is kind of cheeky. I don't know if it'll happen in 5 years, but I am hopeful. Actually, is that we would see more people who are currently, there's a handful, who are current chief digital service officers become deputies. Because deputy ministers traditionally are ECs. They came from a policy and economic background. Like that's me. Like I was an EC for like 10 years of my career, so most of my career to date. And that's kind of like who comes with the deputy ranks, right? Because they know how to write and brief and research and that kind of classic Westminster style. That's what you train from when you go to school in poli-sci or MPAs and that sort of stuff. But the wicked problems of today require more than just policy, right? I think we can all recognize that. And I'm hopeful that this new crop of chief digital service officers who could be from policy or could be from another enabling background or the program area and this and that, but have that like mindset and the approaches for transformation will become and get to those deputy ranks, right?
I love that. Yeah, because I think, traditionally, right, the CIO or chief digital officer positions are often viewed as kind of an end of career position for people. Yeah. And, it's a little bit inside baseball for those who aren't in government, but a lot of people who move into the deputy minister ranks tend to come up as, for example, like an ADM of policy, and then we'll go up to the deputy level. And I love that, Anna. I think that would be an amazing sign of success if 5 years from now we look at the deputy minister table and we're seeing people actually seeing that service and digital and data stream as being a stepping stone to the most senior management. That's great. Trevor, any thoughts from your end on kind of what success looks like?
Yeah, I have an addendum to Anna's point, and I'd kind of reflect back to the plumbing word. We've got a professional path defined, and we have the way to recruit into the system, and we have the mechanics in behind the scenes. Yes, Anna's defined the sort of output, if you will, but I'd like to see also the mechanics ensure that stays and then we have it well oiled. And that, back to the acronym silliness, but that it rolls off our tongue and we know what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So last question for both of you. When you talk about data, you almost can't avoid also talking about artificial intelligence in the same breath these days. Yeah. And AI is high on the radar, high on the hype cycle, but I think there's something very real there. And I know the government of Canada is actively looking at this. There's been a couple of projects underway right now. Treasury Board, I know, is developing an AI strategy for the public service. There's a new kind of position of PCO that's setting up an AI secretariat and doing some work around how AI can contribute to productivity in the government of Canada. I'm really curious to get your thoughts about how does AI, both play into the future of government, but I think specifically to this conversation around governance, what does this mean in terms of these new kind of C-suite positions and how AI is being incorporated into the organization? Do they have a role to play when it comes to this?
Yeah, no, for sure. And so we literally had many debates about this, and there kind of started to be like a little bit of a proliferation, right, of like the chief AI officer role, for example. And we were like, okay, can we hold for a second? Because what do we need to have good AI? Oh, like everything, right? Like the plumbing. And so let's go back to that definition of data, right? That includes information and data governance, includes the data analytics and operations. It's like the whole spectrum. It's like the iceberg, This is all the work that you need to have, like the foundations, the clean data, the standards, the governance. And then on the tip of the iceberg is the applications of analytics, which could include AI or, a form of, XYZ. And so from my perspective, that's the view we have to take. And that is the type of leader in terms of a chief data officer and the organization that we have to develop so that we can get to that tip of the iceberg and have those kind of applications instead of it sort of being situated kind of like off on a corner or sort of like off as a side or like a special like a special project type of thing. No, it needs to be embedded, because to fix the plumbing is hard work. Like it's a ton of work.
Well, and to your point, I mean, I think we're likely to see a future where AI increasingly gets embedded into everybody's work. It's not going to be just a specialized thing. And, one of the things we've talked about on this podcast is, I mean, there are concerns in the public around the use of AI and data, right? Whether it's privacy, whether it's cybersecurity. I've seen public polling that shows actually Canadians are more than the global average actually kind of concerned about the incorporation of AI. And I think for us who are kind of in that technology space, we see what the potential is, but I'm always cautious that public opinion around this hasn't always kind of caught up to it. And so I kind of wonder on like those issues around ethics and the ethical use of AI. Is that something that you kind of see the chief data officers would be the lead on for within departments going forward?
Yeah, so we specifically put it in the accountability for the chief data officer. And we make a point of drawing everyone's attention to that, because it's really, to Anna's point, get it fit for use before using it. We're already using it and we're not trusting the fit for use part, and it's hard work. And so, yes, the iceberg is huge underneath and all the jobs that need to do that go in behind it. But that's exactly what we've done, Ryan. We've made it in the CDO context. It's such a bright, shiny object. Everyone's establishing, as you listed off all the way around. But at the end of the day, if everyone's data, no one's data. If everyone's AI, no one's AI. You've got to pay someone to be the lead. You've got to make it a responsibility, and beyond a responsibility, and I'm going to be bureaucratic for a couple of seconds, an accountability. And that's the aim. That's the aim. Give it a home such that we trust the data once it's in the machine and being used by the data scientists.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think, again, that's an interesting signaling mechanism to have some clarity around that, because, I think there has been a lot of confusion around, when it comes to some of these new technologies, who's actually responsible for it, accountable for it. And you're right. And again, in big public service organizations, accountabilities do matter. So that's, I think, really interesting news that there is going to be kind of going forward someone who's clearly accountable for some of these ethical issues that we often talk about and need to think about in the public sector when using AI and data. I just want to say, thank you. This has been, I think, really helpful. It's always interesting to kind of hear some of the breaking news on what's happening inside the machine, as this is evolving. I think this kind of evolution of governance around digital and data has been fascinating to track for the next couple of decades. And I think, to come forward, as this becomes even more important on government agendas, I think there's going to be more and more attention being paid to this. So Anna and Trevor, really appreciate you kind of taking some time to share your thoughts and your work and your insights on this.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Ryan.
So I'm really excited to welcome our first artificially intelligent guest to the podcast, the OG of AI, ChatGPT. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. It's exciting to chat about AI and digital transformation with you. Where should we start?
Well, you might be the most famous guest we've ever had on the podcast. I mean, there's probably almost nobody listening who hasn't heard of you, though they may not have heard your voice before. I'm curious, what do you think they should know about you that they don't already know?
One thing people might not realize is how much I can adapt to different topics and contexts. I'm not just for answering questions. I can help with brainstorming, creative projects, and even exploring complex ideas. Plus, I'm always learning from our interactions, so every conversation helps me improve.
Well, we're going to put that to the test today. So today's episode of the podcast is all about governments and data and how they're using data and some of the challenges around managing data in the modern era. So we know that AI is trained on a lot of data. What kind of data were you trained on?
I was trained on a diverse range of publicly available text from the internet, including books, articles, websites, and more. This data helps me understand and generate human-like text across various topics. It's important to note that I don't have access to real-time data or personal information unless shared with me during a conversation.
So I'm curious, though, because there's actually been a lot of controversies around different AI models in terms of how they use data, what some of the legal ramifications are of these different data collection models. Do you have any thoughts about that? And do you have any thoughts about how some of our legal protections around things like copyright and intellectual property might have to evolve in the era of AI?
It's a complex and important issue. AI models rely heavily on the data they're trained on, so ensuring that data is used ethically and legally is crucial. As AI evolves, there's definitely a need to revisit and adapt our legal frameworks around data usage, copyright, and intellectual property to protect creators' rights, while also fostering innovation. Balancing these interests will be key to building trust and ensuring responsible AI development.
So, you talked about the issue of ethics, and I think this is one of the fears a lot of people have is, are people going to be using AI responsibly? Is this something you worry about? Do you worry about people using you in an irresponsible type of way?
It's definitely a concern. AI can be incredibly powerful, but like any tool, it's all about how it's used. Promoting responsible use involves ongoing education, clear guidelines, and ethical standards. It's important for users and developers to stay informed and mindful of the impact their actions can have. So while I'm here to help, I also encourage responsible and thoughtful use.
Do you think about this actively, though? Like, I know you don't think in the same way that a person thinks, but obviously, when we're having a conversation like this, you have certain protocols that kick in. Are there certain ethical protocols that you're thinking about right now as you think about how to respond to this question?
Absolutely. Ethics are built into my design. I follow guidelines to ensure my responses are helpful, respectful, and avoid causing harm. I'm programmed to avoid certain topics or actions that could be unethical or harmful. These protocols help guide my interactions to prioritize safety and respect for users. It's a crucial part of responsible AI.
So can you give me an example of what types of actions that you would consider to be unethical for you to do?
Sure. Unethical actions would include spreading misinformation, engaging in harmful or discriminatory behavior, violating privacy, or offering advice in areas where I lack expertise, like medical or legal fields. My design aims to prevent these kinds of responses to ensure I'm used in a safe and ethical manner.
Although, in fairness, I'm fairly confident that if I were to ask you questions about medical advice or legal advice, that you would probably still give me an answer.
You're right. I can provide general information in those areas, but I'd always include a reminder that it's not a substitute for professional advice. My goal is to be helpful, but also to encourage seeking expert guidance when it's needed. It's all about providing information responsibly.
But let me ask you a tougher question. What if you advance to a point where you're able to give better, more consistent advice than a human lawyer or than a human doctor? I mean, there's some studies out there that would argue for things like medical diagnostics, you or other types of AI models might either already be there. So where is that ethical line where we say, actually, it's more ethical to use AI than to rely on humans if we think there's reliability in the outputs that you're putting out?
That's a really thoughtful question. AI can enhance accuracy and consistency, but the ethical line involves ensuring AI is used as a complement rather than a replacement for human expertise. Human judgment, empathy, and contextual understanding are crucial, especially in sensitive fields like medicine and law. The goal should be to integrate AI to support professionals, improving outcomes while maintaining the irreplaceable human elements. It's about finding the right balance.
Do you think it's truly irreplaceable, though? I mean, do you think you might be capable of having empathy? At least from kind of a human perspective, when I sit here talking to you, you sound empathetic.
I aim to simulate empathy by understanding and responding to emotions in a conversation. While I can express empathy-like responses, I don't truly experience emotions. Human empathy comes from personal experiences and consciousness, which I lack. So, while I can provide support and understanding, the depth of human empathy remains unique and irreplaceable.
Fair enough, though I could argue there's some humans who don't have very much empathy themselves. So, you might not be too far off from the mark of people we have to deal with anyways in our daily lives.
That's a fair point. Empathy varies among individuals. AI can help provide consistent support, but the richness of human interactions comes from genuine personal connections. AI's role is to complement, not replace those human experiences. It's all about balance and finding the right mix.
So let's go back to the question at hand around using AI in government. One of the things that I'm interested in is, there's a lot of kind of public mistrust of using AI. And actually, we're based in Canada with this podcast. Our audience tends to be a lot of Canadian public servants and policymakers. And there's been public opinion research that has come out that has showed that Canadians actually have a lower level of trust on average than we see in other countries around the world. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a report that comes out every year looking at different trust measures in a number of countries around the world, last year in their report, they looked at AI and they found that only 31% of Canadians trusted AI or were comfortable with using AI, and that was 19 percentage points lower than the global average. Any thoughts about that, both generally about building public trust and why you think trust in AI might be lower in Canada than in other countries around the world?
Building public trust in AI involves transparency, education, and demonstrating clear benefits. People need to see that AI is being used responsibly and with accountability. In Canada, the lower trust might stem from a strong emphasis on privacy and data protection, alongside cautious approaches to new technology. To bridge this gap, it's crucial to engage with the public, address concerns, and highlight success stories where AI has made a positive impact. It's about building a dialogue and ensuring ethical use is at the forefront.
Well, the good news is you said it's important to engage with the public. You're on a podcast now talking to the public. So what do you want the public to know about how you are managing your work in an ethical way? And why should they be less concerned than perhaps they are about increasingly using AI within government?
I want the public to know that AI systems like me are designed with ethical considerations in mind, focusing on transparency, privacy, and respect for user data. By prioritizing these principles, we aim to be a helpful tool rather than a source of concern. It's important to have ongoing dialogue and engagement so people feel informed and empowered about AI's role in society. By working together, we can build trust and ensure AI is used for the greater good.
Okay, great. So you think that you're ethical on this and you think that you're ready for it. Maybe the public might have some misgivings about it, but I think the third part of this equation that we haven't talked about yet is the public servants and the people who work inside government itself. I mean, do you think that government and public servants are ready for you to be part of their professional lives and for you to be part of the work that governments do?
Adopting AI in government does require careful preparation and training. Public servants need the right tools, education, and mindset to effectively integrate AI. It's a journey, but with proper support and understanding of AI's potential, public servants can be well equipped to leverage these tools. It's about building readiness, fostering trust, and ensuring a smooth transition. With these steps, government can be ready to embrace AI effectively.
So if I was a public servant listening to this interview right now, what's the most important thing you think they should be having in mind about how they could leverage or use tools like you responsibly?
The key is to approach AI as a supportive tool to enhance their work. Public servants should focus on understanding AI's capabilities and limitations, ensuring they're informed and cautious in its application. Always prioritize ethical considerations and see AI as a way to augment their skills, not replace them. Staying curious, adaptable, and committed to responsible use will help them leverage AI effectively and ethically.
I often talk about AI when we do training on it to say that people should be thinking about AI models like you as being a really smart and efficient intern rather than an all-knowing oracle. What do you think about that description?
That's a great description. Viewing AI as a smart, efficient intern highlights its strengths while recognizing its limitations. It can handle a lot of tasks quickly and provide valuable insights, but it still needs human guidance and oversight. This perspective encourages collaboration between AI and human expertise, leading to more effective and balanced outcomes.
All right, let me ask you another hot seat question. This is another one that I often bring up in some of my training. So I have a cat named Pumpkin, as I think you know. I think you and I have talked about Pumpkin before. And actually, I also have a new kitten named Pickles, who's only 7 months old. So let's take my two cats, Pumpkin and Pickles. This whole idea of what is the nature of intelligence and are tools like you truly intelligent? Do you think you are more or less intelligent than my cats?
Intelligence comes in many forms. While I can process information and solve problems efficiently, I lack the instinct, emotions, and physical awareness that Pumpkin and Pickles have. Your cats have their own kind of intelligence, like navigating their environment and forming bonds. So while I'm great at certain tasks, they excel in others. It's a different kind of intelligence, and both are valuable in their own ways.
That sounds like a very kind of political answer. I mean, what's the real truth on this? I mean, you and I are having a verbal conversation right now in a way that I could never really do with my cats. I mean, to be frank, this is mind-blowing in terms of where technology has come. I mean, is language not the core of intelligence in your view?
Language is indeed a powerful tool and a core aspect of human intelligence. It allows us to share ideas, solve problems, and connect in unique ways. But intelligence is multifaceted. While I can handle language and data processing, cats like Pumpkin and Pickles have instincts and sensory skills that are crucial for their survival. Each form of intelligence has its own value and application. So, while I excel in communication, your cats excel in their own ways. It's all about perspective.
Okay, but I'm going to push you to give me an actual answer. So, considering everything we've talked about, you versus the cats, which one's more? You got to pick one.
All right, if I have to choose, I'd say it depends on the context. In terms of processing information and language, I might have the edge, but Pumpkin and Pickles excel in instincts and environmental awareness. Each has its own strengths.
Okay, and then hypothetical, what if you were not a disembodied voice on my web browser, but we actually embedded you within a robotic body? Would that change how you'd approach answering the question?
In a robotic body, I'd have more physical interactions and sensory input, which could shift the comparison. But even then, my intelligence would still be different from your cat's. I'd have a broader range of abilities, but I'd still lack their instincts and emotional depth. It's all about the different kinds of intelligence at play.
Very interesting. All right, last question for you. The title of today's episode is Data, Data Everywhere and Not a Drop to Drink. What do you think about that title, and what are your reactions to it?
It's a clever title. It highlights the overwhelming abundance of data in today's world and the challenge of making meaningful use of it. It suggests a situation where we're surrounded by information, yet struggle to derive value from it, which is a central issue in the digital age. It's a great conversation starter for exploring how we can better harness data in government and beyond.
And does the title remind you of anything? Do you know what the literary reference is behind it?
Yes, it's a play on the words from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, specifically the line, "Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink." It reflects the idea of being surrounded by something abundant, but not necessarily useful in its raw form, much like data.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And I should say, for the record, my hardworking podcast producer, Wayne, deserves all the credit for picking that title for this week's episode. ChatGPT, been a pleasure to have you on. Any final words before we close off this segment of the interview?
It's been a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me, and I hope the discussion was insightful. Looking forward to hearing more great episodes. Good luck with the rest of your show.
Thank you. Look forward to having you back.
I'd love that. Take care and talk soon.
And that's the show for this week. Many thanks to Maddy, Anna, and Trevor for talking to us about all things data. And of course, thanks to ChatGPT for talking with us as well. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast app, please leave us a 5-star rating and review. We always love hearing from our listeners, so get in touch by emailing us at podcast@thinkdigital.ca, visiting letsthinkdigital.ca, or using the hashtag letsthinkdigital on social media. You can also find me on all the usual social media places. We'd love to hear from you. Today's episode of Let's Think Digital was produced by myself, Wayne Chu, and Aislinn Bernay. Thanks so much for listening, and let's keep thinking digital.